So good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Clemens Fuest, and it's a great pleasure for me, indeed, to welcome you to the 76th Annual Congress of the IIPF and the first Congress online. As you all know, the pandemic has forced the IIPF to cancel the physical Congress, but here we are coming together in the web, sitting hopefully comfortably in our home offices, no ties, no traveling. So that has its advantages, although we would, of course, have preferred to meet physically in Iceland. Now, the Congress theme, as announced in the call for papers last year, is public finance, natural resources, and climate change. And of course, we will discuss these issues in the light of the current corona crisis. And there are many links and many connections, as we will see. Now, let me emphasize, I am very grateful that this year's local organizers agreed to change their plans and do this Congress online. They also agreed to hold a second IIPF Congress next year, hopefully with physical presence in Iceland. Now, to my knowledge, this has never happened before in the history of the IIPF, having two congresses organized by the same team. But let me turn back to this year. We determined Iceland to be the venue for 2020 a few years ago. We found scientific chairs who started their work last year and put together a great set of keynotes and working group sessions. In normal times, we would all be on stage here together, the local organizer, Professor Torolfur Mathiasson, and the scientific organizers, Mireille Chiroleux-Assoulin and Marco Runke. Now, this year, you have to watch us on the stage one after the other, or at different times. But if you attend all 3 Congress days, we will certainly meet. You will meet all of us. So I encourage everyone, of course, to attend the sessions, but also to meet after the sessions outside the program. The tool for this online Congress is Hop-In. So thanks to all of you for hopping in. Please stay in and do not hop off before Friday evening after the last keynote and the award ceremony. There will be social gatherings offered in Hop-In, meet and greet, and so on. I recommend you not to switch off your device to attend the sessions, but then continue chatting with your colleagues afterwards. Our local organizer, Totti Mathiasson, will be able to tell you more about this and other organizational aspects of the online Congress. So my warmest thanks to the whole team in Iceland and also to the scientific organizers for taking up the burden to change the organization of the Congress and for setting up what I think is a great program for this online Congress. So I wish you all an exciting conference. Enjoy the IIPF's first online Congress. And now over to our local organizer, Professor Torolfur Mathiasson. Totti, the floor is yours.
Dear fellow public economists, it's my pleasure on behalf of the local organizing committee to invite you all to this online conference. An online conference is, of course, an imperfect substitute for a physical conference. We can see one another's faces, but hugs and handshakes are not only off limits, but completely impossible. Furthermore, it is impossible to participate in excursions and the physical experience of Reykjavik with her coffee shops and bars, nightlife, and early morning trip to the swimming pool. We have done our best to provide a platform that enables workshops and keynote lectures. Thus, the intellectual and the scholarly content of this online conference is hopefully on par with earlier conferences. You should use the opportunity to contact friends using the Hop-In platform or email or Skype or whatever. Hop-In is a pool substitute for a morning swim or bar hopping. Hopefully, we can make up for that next year. In my inbox, I did find an email from former president of the IIPF, Joel Slemrod, dated August 17th, 2016. In that email and the following Skype chat, he asked if the University of Iceland could possibly host an IIPF conference. I offered some plausible excuses, none of which did fly with Joel. Hence, it was decided on an IIPF board meeting in Tokyo in 2018 that the 2020 conference would be in Reykjavik. The preparation of the event was on my to-do list every other week during the period of 2018 to 2019, but has occupied a far bigger part of my working day this last year. My worries and practical tasks have been shared by Guðrún Jónsson and others of the local organizing committee. They raised funds that hopefully will come to good use next year. You can see a list of the sponsors on the homepage of the conference. I hope that I am forgiven to mention the Central Bank of Iceland and its former governor, Mark Guðmundsson, as well as the team at the Prime Minister's office as great benefactors of the Congress. I would also like to extend my thanks to the rector of the University of Iceland, Jón Atli Benediktsson, who will address the conference later in this opening ceremony. The last year, Pálmi Gautur Sverrisson has taken most of the heat regarding the practical side of planning the Congress. He made arrangements with the hotels and the Blue Lagoon and other parties. He negotiated a very exciting dinner party for next Friday. When we decided to go online, he did go for that task full in. Without him, there would be no conference this year. For the last 3 months, we have had the joy of working with a team of 5 students. Many of you have already met 1 or 2 of them. They astonish me every day with their skillful solutions to every problem that has surfaced. They are Ásdís, who became an expert on hopping overnight and wrote up all the instructions for keynote speakers, workshop speakers, etc. Furthermore, Andri and Benedikt, Bergþór and Guðni have been guiding all the speakers. They deserve the gratitude if all goes well. I deserve the blame should it not. I have repeatedly said that I would not have accepted the tasks initiated by Joel Slemrod had I known what it did entail in terms of work and effort. I can extend that to the task initiated by Clemens Fust to move the conference into cyberspace. It has been a lot of work. Now it is your responsibility to make the conference joyful and successful so that all that work has been to some good. Happy conference.
Thank you very much, Totti, and we will do, I can assure you, our very best. I think we will all do our very best to make this a successful conference, and thanks again to you and your entire team for making this effort to organize this. Now, it's a pleasure for me now to introduce our first keynote speaker. Our first keynote speaker at this conference is Atma Edenhofer. I'm sure many of you know him. Atma Edenhofer is one of the world's leading scholars on the economics and politics of climate change. Let me still say a few words to introduce him. Atma Edenhofer is Director and Chief Economist of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, as well as Director of the Mercator Research Institute on Global Commons and Climate Change. He's also Professor on the Economics of Climate Change at the Technical University in Berlin. Atma Edenhofer has published numerous articles in leading journals, including Science, PNAS, Nature, Climate Change, and many others, also leading economics journals, like the Journal of Environmental Economics and Management. Now, like all of us, the keynote speakers had to change and adjust their planned speeches and presentations. And so did Atma. So the title of his keynote is Pigou, in the post-corona era. And I'm very much looking forward to this presentation. So welcome, Atma. Thanks for accepting this. And the floor is yours.
Again, it's a great honor. And what I would like to do is, in this presentation, is to give a tribute on the occasion of the 100th anniversary of the publication of the Economics of Welfare. So basically, it's the one of the Pigouvian Tax highlighted in the Economics of Welfare exactly 100 years ago. And if you read the text of Pigou, it has two important components. The first proposition is, if marginal private benefits are lower than social benefits, there's too little production and a subsidy is needed. And in the opposite case, a tax is needed, and then we refer to the optimal Pigouvian tax that maximizes welfare. And despite costs, there is a theoretical consensus that Pigouvian taxes are a good idea, and some believe Pigouvian taxes are a very good idea. And there's a diverse group of supporters of Pigouvian taxation, ranging from Joseph Stiglitz, Niklas Stern, Bill Nordhaus, Greg Mankiw, and Milton Friedman. And all of them arguing that not paying the costs of the damage to the environment, it's a subsidy, just as not paying the full costs of workers would be. And this is again the same argument, and Greg Mankiw argues that he is a strong believer in Pigouvian taxation. And in addition to that, his argument is it's just an educational issue for the public and for the policymakers. The next gentleman I would like to refer here is, it's probably not perceived as an economist, but even in his environmental encyclical Laudato Si, Pope Francis highlighted the principle of the social costs and the Pigouvian taxation as an ethical principle, that activities on the market can only be considered as ethical when all the social costs are taken into account. So there is a diverse group of supporters of the Pigouvian taxation, and the question is, why is there doubts of the political viability of the Pigouvian taxation? In this lecture, I will use the term Pigouvian taxation in the following sense. With taxation, I refer to direct pricing in contrast to indirect pricing via emissions trading. A price collar, for example, is subsumed under direct pricing schemes, so hybrid systems can be designed in a way which is very similar to direct pricing. In what follows in this keynote, I will defend two claims. The first claim is there are sound theoretical reasons for calling the feasibility of Pigouvian taxation into question. And secondly, this consensus is somewhat spurious in that the political success of Pigouvian taxation is higher than a single-minded focus on the reasons I will elaborate in point one would suggest. Now, the sound part of the consensus, what are the reasons for the difficulties of implementing the Pigouvian taxation? And I have highlighted 6 reasons. The first one is the enormous uncertainties about the marginal benefits, in particular the social costs of carbon. For example, within the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, most economists argue that social costs of carbon are probably not a reasonable device for policymakers due to these huge uncertainties. The second objection might be the regressive distributional impacts on poor households. Many policymakers, when they are advised to put a carbon price on emissions, they immediately respond that they are afraid of the regressive distributional impacts. The third aspect is more a political one. The fragmented responsibilities of ministries lead to excessive focus on sector-specific policies and or technology policies. The fourth argument, there are commitment problems. So when there is a unified carbon price across all the sectors, if policymakers in an ideal world would be committed to a price path, investors would form stable expectations and they would invest according to the marginal abatement costs. But when there is no commitment, so then there is a problem for the investors, and then some of them might require sector-specific or technology-specific policies with all the inefficiencies occurred by these policies. The lack of acceptance and the commodification of objection, carbon pricing and carbon markets are perceived as repugnant by some environmental groups. They are quite vocal in the public arena, and this is a reason why many policymakers also do not trust that in the end carbon prices will be accepted. And the last point is the problem of incomplete international cooperation. When one jurisdiction imposes a high carbon price, so there's the risk of carbon leakage and the loss of competition. Now, nevertheless, this consensus only partially reflects the reality. Here, this is one of the last numbers from the World Bank, and you can see over the last 30 years we can observe an increasing number of carbon pricing schemes, ranging from carbon taxes to all sorts of emission trading scheme and hybrid systems. Currently, 22% of the global emissions are under a carbon pricing scheme, and we have worldwide 61 institutional settings for the implementation. So in that sense, since the 2000 years, we have seen remarkable implementation of that. Still, only 22% of the global emissions are under a carbon pricing regime. Now, let me explain a little bit, at least from my observation, Pigouvian taxation in the wild, a brief history in 3 acts. And here I would like to refer to national policies, and in particular to the German case. I was in the last 2 years very much involved in the German debate to give carbon pricing much more attention in our climate and energy policy. The second level was the EU climate policy, which still is one of the most important games in town, and in particular the new implemented EU Green Deal could provide, I would call this a Pigouvian moment for the transformation of the energy and the transport sector. And in my last section, I would like to refer to international climate policy, and here particular to coal, capital and cooperation. And here I highlight an important aspect in the post-COVID situation. I will argue here that in the post-COVID situation, coal will become, or there's a risk that coal will become even more important than before the COVID crisis. Now let me start with national policies, the German case. Now, the German case was a quite interesting one because the main reason why Germany in the last 2 years has started to think about carbon pricing has a twofold reason. The first one was, at one night, German negotiators in Brussels agreed on the so-called European Effort Sharing Regulation. The European Effort Sharing Regulation has imposed on each EU member states some kind of quantity targets. But in contrast to the previous negotiations or the previous results, when a member state cannot fulfill these quantity targets, it has to pay a penalty. So the risk to pay a penalty, and a quite high penalty, in combination with the Fridays for the Future on the street, the German government, the German Grand Coalition, has to think about a redesign of the German energy and climate policy, in particular in the so-called non-ETS sector, which consists of transport, heating, and building. So what we did here is, and what you can see here is on the blue line, this is the carbon price and the growth rate of the carbon price, which would be needed to fulfill this European effort sharing regulation, roughly, with a lot of uncertainties. And the German government, in particular the Chancellor, announced that there is now a paradigm shift in Germany, that Germany wants to move from regulation to direct carbon pricing. And then the cabinet has decided that in 2021, there should be a 10 euros per ton, 10 euros per ton CO2, a carbon price out at the ETS. It should grow a little bit, and after 2025, this should be transformed into a national emissions trading scheme as an upstream system, in particular for oil and gas, because coal is primarily dealt within the EU ETS. And after 2025, so in this emissions trading scheme, probably a price collar will be defined, but there should be then a trading scheme with a price building mechanisms on a relatively free market. So this cabinet decision has been revised a little bit, so they will not start at 10 euros per ton CO2, but roughly about 25 euros per ton CO2, and end up in 2025 with 55 euros per ton CO2. But in order to fulfill the European effort sharing regulation by 2030, there's a likelihood that in Germany we will see a carbon price above 100 euros per ton CO2. It seems to me that's a quite remarkable step, and I will also highlight a few of the main problems. One problem was distributional concerns. Germany has addressed this distributional concern. An equal per capita recycling has been rejected, but they have reduced the electricity prices and have increased the social transfers. And this made the carbon pricing scheme less regressive and much more progressive. So you can see at the equal per capita, it's a quite progressive scheme. Just the reduction of electricity prices and social transfer basically reduces the regressivity, but we could do much better with simpler recycling schemes. So in the end, this was good enough for the public acceptance and also for the majority in the parliament. But still, there is a huge problem here. And the huge problem is that for the next few years, Germany will see a wide range of effective carbon pricing in the electricity sector, in the residential sector, and in the transport sector. And in particular, I will show you then in a minute, when the European Green Deal imposes an additional burden on transport and in the residential sector, this might even widen the effective carbon prices and the overall efficiency across the sectors. So therefore, this problem has not been addressed successfully, and it would require a large-scale energy tax reform in the future, and also to address the different externalities in the transport sector. I will come to this in a minute. Now there is the debate in the public about the repugnant markets and the mistrust about carbon pricing, that it could not work or it is not acceptable and it could even destroy moral motivations. Here we have published quite recently a study in Nature Sustainability together with Axel Ockenfels and Peter Werner. And here what we did is we conducted an experiment. In this experiment, we want to measure how moral behavior interacts with pricing regimes, in particular with direct pricing via taxation or cap and trade mechanisms. And it turns out that the direct pricing scheme can incentivize voluntary abatement activities in a much broader sense than the quantity-based mechanisms. And here you can see this in figure 1. Here you have the auction mechanisms, and there is only a quite small amount of voluntary additional abatements where you have in the price mechanism. So then you have much higher voluntary contributions beyond what profit maximization would allow the agents to do. And direct pricing increases voluntary abatement, and it is not true that the direct pricing destroys, so to say, moral motivations. The contrary is true. And the reason is quite simple, because in the auction mechanism, over time, people realize that when somebody is undertaking voluntary abatement, this leads to a declining price, and the declining price basically leads to emission increase by other people, and in the end, this both aspects cancel each other out. In the price mechanism, the price is stable, and then the voluntary abatement pays off. So in that sense, this is just an experiment, but it is interesting to see that now we see much more research try to figure out to what extent and to what extent incentives, economic incentives, can strengthen a crowd in moral behavior. Now let me summarize this first part. The world is second best at best, of course, and there remains the problem of the uncertainty about the social costs of carbon, but there are steps toward a solution, setting prices which are consistent with the quantity targets. This could also form some stable expectations for the investors. Distributional concerns, not ideally resolved, no per capita recycling, but the reduction of the regressive energy tax was a reasonable step in the right direction. Repugnant markets, this issue can be resolved by a price floor because a price floor mimics direct pricing. And admittedly, this is just one experiment, but we need more experiments showing or rejecting how direct pricing interacts with moral behavior or voluntary abatement. One important aspect remains the inefficient sector-specific policies. Germany has formed a climate cabinet, so we have overcome the fragmented responsibilities of the ministries, but nevertheless, we see a wide range of effective carbon prices which are highly inefficient. Is there a commitment device? To a certain extent, yes. We have a law on a national emissions trading scheme. And in particular, we have the EU Green Deal, which basically creates a strong incentive, or even more than an incentive, almost an obligation to think in a new way about Pigouvian pricing in the EU member states, also in Germany. And let me explain this a little bit, what are the scenarios here. And here I will argue that the European Green Deal might create a Pigouvian moment in Europe. Now, the European Green Deal is a very complicated animal, and here I would like to highlight only one aspect. And the aspect is that the EU Commission intends to tighten the emission targets to 50 to 55% overall. Now, there are two basic scenarios available, and here I highlight the first scenario, and I call this the muddling through scenario. The muddling through scenario will be that the ETS sector remains almost untouched by this tightening of the emission target, but there will be all the obligations has to be fulfilled in the non-ETS sector, in particular for buildings and transport. So then this would lead to an emission reduction from 38% to almost 50% level compared to the 2005 level. So what will be the implication? The implication would be, in particular for Germany, but all the other EU member states, we will see even an increasing divergence of the effective carbon prices across the sectors, and then increasing inefficiencies. And here you can already see the effective carbon prices, not just for one country, but for the Europe as a whole. And we have a range almost for zero effective carbon pricing for biomass to 350 euros per ton CO2. And this range would be increased by this scenario, where basically all this additional emission reduction obligations will be fulfilled by the non-ETS sector. There's an additional complexity here, and this complexity is when we talk about the transport sector, it is not wise and it is not appropriate just to think about climate change. Within the transport sector, we are confronted and faced with multiple externalities: climate change, air pollution, congestion, and accidents. And for these multiple externalities, you need multiple instruments to deal with these externalities. And this is something which makes carbon pricing in the transport sector even more complicated. In the EU, we have fuel taxes, standards, and vehicle taxes. And of course, the fuel taxes, standards, and vehicle taxes have a tendency to increase the fuel economy, but there is a significant rebound effect. 5 to 30% of the energy savings are lost because consumers drive their efficient cars more frequently. So here we need not just carbon pricing, we have to think about the complementary policies like the technology standards, which are really vulnerable to significant rebound effects, but also the reform of the other taxes, because all these taxes have nothing to do with the externalities. They are basically implemented due to the intent of the politicians to raise additional revenues. So there might be another quite aggressive or another extreme scenario where nothing will happen in the non-ETS because of the high marginal abatement costs, but everything has to be done within the ETS. And here we have calculated what would be the implication for the carbon price. The carbon price in the EU ETS will increase significantly between 52 and 75 euros per ton CO2, which is quite significant. This would lead to an accelerated coal phase out, not only in Germany, but also in the whole European Union. We will see higher carbon prices, but then the debate on the border adjustment mechanisms will raise. Some people might argue for a compensation measure of the international offsets, but this emphasizes again that we need here a kind of a flexibility between the non-ETS sector and the ETS sector. And by and large, I do not see another way that we have to integrate the ETS sector and the non-ETS sector at least gradually. And this I call a Pigouvian moment, because the inefficiency, the ambition in terms of the target are so high, and the potential inefficiencies because of the different carbon prices are so significant that it seems to me we have a Pigouvian moment. On the one hand, we can integrate ETS and non-ETS at least gradually, and at the same time we might find a reasonable way to address the other externalities. So this is the current price of CO2. So there was not a significant decline due to the COVID crisis. The Market Stability Reserve did a good job in the short term, but the Market Stability Reserve might destabilize the allowance market in the long term, at least. So we have some studies indicating this. And therefore, I would also argue that EU ETS should be complemented by a direct pricing scheme, a minimum price, because this could stabilize the price and the expectation in the long run. So let me summarize here the EU. The EU is the archetypal second best institution, and the uncertainty about the carbon prices can be addressed by a minimum price or by a price floor. It seems to me that would be a reasonable way forward. The distributional concerns require some kind of a coordination of the national energy tax reform. Otherwise, we cannot address the multiple externalities, and this needs some coordination also in Europe. The price floor can mimic the direct pricing, and then to overcome the problem of idiosyncratic preferences of the member states, when some member states, some individuals want to do more. The inefficient sector-specific policies, this remains, and an incremental integration of EU ETS and non-ETS seems to me the right way to do. And I observe an increasing awareness of the problem, and also an increasing agreement that this could be a reasonable way to do. A commitment device, that's a huge problem, because there are a lot of the commitment device is not available, and investors have a hard time to form stable expectations, because what we understand now in the EU ETS, investors and traders are quite sensitive to the announcement of political measures. And cooperation might be doable due to explicit and implicit transfers, what you can observe in particular between Germany and Poland. So far so good. So this is this was the EU climate policy. But what you can see here is in the EU climate policy, it's not just a very ambitious goal for 2030. The EU Commission has announced carbon neutrality by 2050. This might be only an aspirational goal, but nevertheless, it is quite important to understand the importance of international cooperation. And I see basically the border adjustment mechanism, the debate about this, that now there's not only the intention to raise additional revenues, but also to take into account the problems of international climate policy. Now, what is carbon pricing on a global scale? It is probably not good enough to think about the number of carbon pricing schemes. It is much more important to think about the effective carbon rate. And almost 50% of the global emissions are not under a carbon pricing scheme. The effective carbon rate is 0, and only 10% of the emissions are roughly consistent with the 2-degree target. That's you might say that's an encouraging message, but at least there is a lot of room for improvement and a lot of room for work. Now, what happened during the Corona crisis, and I find this quite remarkable. So despite of the widespread lockdown, the emissions have been reduced, but only to 2006 levels. And this is for me a quite clear indication that degrowth and such kind of things like a lockdown will never lead to a situation where we can reduce emissions in the long run. So this was a short shock. But what we can observe is that the post-COVID-19 emissions will continue to rise unless there is no reliable policies in many parts on the globe. And here you can see basically after the Asian financial crisis, and even after the global financial crisis, there was after the recovery, the emission trajectory remains almost the same. Now, what are the reasons why I believe that we are at least at risk that the emissions will rise after recovery again? And this has a lot to do with one issue, and this is the issue of coal. And let me explain this a little bit more in detail. Now, here you have the aspirational goals of the Paris Agreement, the 2-degree target and the 1.5-degree target. And what we can learn from climate physics and climate economics, every temperature target can be translated into a global carbon budget. And of course, there is a lot of uncertainty about the global carbon budget, but roughly speaking, this is here the uncertainty bar, 1,000 gigatons CO2 as a global carbon budget, a remaining carbon budget, which we can use in order to limit the increase of global mean temperature around 2 degrees is a reasonable number. Again, there's a lot of uncertainty. The 1.5 budget is even more ambitious. It's between, let's say, a little bit above 500 gigatons, and here, if you want to be on the safe side, only 200 gigatons. But if you basically calculate the cumulative emissions of all the infrastructure, building, bridges, without coal, so over the economic lifetime, the whole infrastructure will emit roughly a little bit less than 500 gigatons CO2. So we are still committed to these emissions. Now let me talk a little bit about coal. Here you have the coal-fired plants which are operating, under construction, planned and shelved. In China, in India, in the OECD countries, and the rest of the world. And here I would like to highlight, this is not only an issue of the large Asian countries like China and India, it's also an issue for the smaller countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, Bangladesh, and others. So, and here you can see basically that the operating coal-fired plants alone will basically close the door for the 1.5 degree target. And if basically the shelved coal-fired plant will come back into the pipeline, so then we are very close to absorb the majority of the carbon budget which is available when we want to limit the increase of global mean temperature around 2 degrees. And what we can see now currently is that the shelved coal-fired plants come now back into the pipeline, because many countries believe, rightly or wrongly, that coal-fired plants have in a particular large fiscal multiplier. And due to this large fiscal multiplier, so then they might think investment in coal-fired plants are a good idea. But this speculation about the large fiscal multiplier, and the literature is very sparse about the extent of the fiscal multiplier for coal-fired plants. There's another issue which seems to me is much more important for the near-term future, and in particular for the post-COVID situation. And this is the problem of the cost of capital, in particular for the renewables. So what this graph shows is that here you have the average capital costs, and you have the CO2 price. And the contour lines here show the expected share of renewables given a certain CO2 price and certain capital costs. And here you can see basically that, of course, in Germany, for example, the capital costs for PV are quite small, but the capital costs for PV and wind in Vietnam and India are quite high. So this clearly indicates that capital costs for renewables are much more important than for the fossil fuel power plants, because for the renewables, the upfront investments are much more important. The fixed costs are much more important. And here the vertical lines show the average capital costs for investments in renewables in selected countries and regions. So the capital costs affect the effectiveness of the CO2 prices significantly, and in particular in these high capital cost countries. So the carbon price is low, and in addition to this increasing capital costs, the effectiveness of the carbon price will decrease. So in that sense, the cost of capital seems to me a very, very important problem, and this seems to me also in the midterm the reason why many countries, in particular in Southeast Asia, will rely on coal and will continue to invest in coal. So this makes international cooperation to a coal problem. And this is just a cluster analysis, but it seems to me, despite of the technicalities of this cluster analysis, it is a useful analysis because it shows that we have oil and gas states, and with this oil and gas states, the climate laws is very low, fossil fuel subsidies are high, oil and gas rents are high, democracies are weak, corruption is high, trust is low, climate awareness is low. But oil and gas states are not the main problem. They only basically have 5% of the population, and they are responsible for 6% of the emissions. But the coal development and the coal dependent countries, this is the most important problem, because they have 48% of the global population and 70% of the global emissions. So we have to deal with this coal problem with weak carbon, with low carbon prices and high capital costs. And so from my point of view, I have chosen this map because it shows clearly how complicated, how demanding international cooperation will be. And for the next, for the midterm and the short term, I would say climate policy is primarily a coal problem. How could we do this? In a recent paper with my colleague Ulrike Koenig, I have shown that conditional transfers in combination with a negotiation about carbon prices could help to increase international cooperation when countries are compensated for their mitigation costs, in particular when the mitigation costs are above the global average. One way to do this could be an investment fund, and the investment fund could be used to reduce the capital costs, to provide credits below the capital market interest rate in order to reduce the risk premium for countries like Bangladesh and incentivize them to use credits not for coal-fired plants, but for renewables. But then they have to implement a reasonable climate policy. That's a very complicated process, but nevertheless, it is worthwhile for the EU to think how they can enhance international cooperation. Otherwise, I'm afraid that we will not be successful in reduce the global emissions. And I think a paradigm shift is needed in international climate policy. Even international climate policy should focus much more on carbon pricing instead of negotiating voluntary contributions. And in the recent European Economic Review, I published a paper together with Ulrike Koenig showing this a little bit more in detail. So coal is a burden on the global carbon budget, as is the expansion of the infrastructure. The high cost of capital prevents the expansion of renewable energies and favors coal-fired plants, and international cooperation is needed, and if designed properly, hopefully possible. And here, as economists, we have to play an important role. Now, what are the challenges ahead of us? We have to deal with the uncertainty about the carbon prices, and a step towards a solution would be, from my point of view, rule-based adaptive learning processes, where people can understand there's a long-term quantity target and we adapt the pricing to this. But in addition to that, it seems to me it is important that we not just talk about carbon prices and the risk-free premium, we should think about the risk premium. That's a quite important aspect of the whole debate, including in the whole carbon pricing debate, risk premiums and capital asset priced models to calculate this risk premium for abatement policies, but also for climate damages in a much more reasonable way. The uncertainty about the price elasticities are huge, but nevertheless, here you can see a carbon price dependent on this target in the non-ETS. It's a huge range, but so there is some convergence across models and across econometric studies. And it seems to me with such an adaptive rule-based learning process, we might iterate, and this could improve the policy making significantly. The second aspect, which is quite important, is horizontal equity. Horizontal equity has been ignored in the public policy debate, but also in the debate within public finance. Here, my feeling is we need better models because, for example, overcoming the rural-urban divide is a quite important thing. And if horizontal equity is an important, then just the equal per capita recycling is not good enough. And here I would like to refer to a result of one of our papers. When households have different capabilities to transform their energy use or their energy demand into reasonable energy use, so then you have energy intensive households and energy efficient households, households who can deal with this much more efficient than others. And then transfers have to depend not just on income, but also on the capability to deal with households and to improve energy efficiency. Policymakers in public debates concentrate more on horizontal effects and hardship cases, and research is needed on optimal policy design on differentiated transfers taxes or non-linear taxes with horizontal heterogeneity. Incentives and moral behaviors, the crowding in of intrinsic motivation seems to me in times of Fridays for the Future will play a more important role. And it might be useful to show that Pigouvian pricing and Pigouvian taxation crowds in intrinsic motivations and does not crowd it out. Inefficient sector-specific policies for the European scale, the integration of trading schemes, national tax reform, and the reform of complementary policies seems to me important. And these huge inefficiencies which can observe in Europe might create a Pigouvian moment. Commitment device, why not think about an independent European carbon bank? A cooperation, conditional transfers, negotiation on carbon prices at an international scale in order to give the international climate policy a new push, new insights and fresh ideas. And of course, political economy, we have to think about compensation schemes because of concentrated costs and benefits versus the dispersed costs and benefits. Now let me conclude. So what I would like to communicate in this keynote is Pigou is alive. There might be a consensus that there are a lot of practical problems for the implementation of Pigou, but there are indeed thorny problems, casting doubt on the political feasibility of the Pigouvian taxation, but the consensus unjustly disregards the political success of the later, and we can build on these political successes. Today, 100 years after the publication of Pigou's opus magnum, we see remarkable success stories even under second best conditions. There might be a Pigouvian moment within the EU because of its ambitious targets and the high inefficiencies. And my last comment is we economists can help significantly to enhance the implementation of this idea. We have to provide more sophisticated research, which goes beyond the obvious. I think sometimes we should listen to the problems of the policymakers, but at the same time, we should tell the policymakers what a marvelous idea it is to implement Pigouvian prices and taxes. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much. I think this was a fantastic keynote to get us started here because it was so comprehensive. It really brought together recent research results and policy questions. And it was also optimistic. A lot of talk about climate change is we need international cooperation, which is difficult to achieve. And I think this keynote lecture has really talked about how it can be done, which is great. So we have roughly 20 minutes for discussion. I would like to, so first of all, if I see this correctly, all participants are invited to ask questions, but this needs to be done through the chat. So I would invite everybody to write questions into the chat, and we would then pass them on to Professor Edenhofer. I would like to start out with a question of understanding. You mentioned that a lot of governments, if I understand correctly, consider coal as having a large fiscal multiplier. Do you mean by that it's considered as a cheap source of energy if we abstract from the environmental costs because the capital cost is higher? Or what does that mean, a large fiscal multiplier?
Yeah, thanks a lot. Now it is meant, so to say, what macroeconomists perceive as a fiscal multiplier. You create a fiscal multiplier larger than one. So if you invest in a coal-fired plant, you can create a lot more. So you get more than €1 when you do this in the macroeconomic term, in the macroeconomic sense, the high fiscal multiplier. So they perceive this. And it's not an efficiency argument. It's an argument about designing rescue packages.
Okay, and that's because we build factories. And,
exactly.
Why is that? Okay, so
it's a Keynesian argument, not an efficiency argument.
Okay. Let me maybe directly add one other question. So you discussed this question of how we can get people to cooperate. And you said, why not set up a fund, if I understand correctly, in the EU? So that's one option. Another widely discussed option is this idea of climate clubs, for instance, telling countries, okay, if you want to do trade with the EU, you need to have a carbon price, or you need to adhere to certain standards. So how does that idea fit in here? Do you think it shouldn't be pursued, or it has less potential, or is it complementary?
Yeah, I'm a little bit skeptical about this idea of carbon clubs, because in the end you need a carbon tariff, and most of the models, in particular the Nordhaus model on this, excludes one important aspect, and this is retaliation. And I don't like the idea that climate policy as a global public good problem is then embedded in a scenario of trade wars and such kind of things. So it might be a threat, but I would like to embed the whole thing more in free trade and more in international cooperation instead of imposing a carbon tariff on other countries. And there are a lot of practical problems for this border tax adjustment. So I would say yes, in some exceptional cases, for when you have an energy intensive sector which is exposed to international competition, that might be an option. But I think it is much more important to enhance international cooperation than to start with tariffs and risk retaliation and trade wars.
Right, and if the EU started that, as you say, you know, a fund and helping countries, so would, I mean, the obvious objection would be, okay, the EU pays for it and everybody else watches, so there's another free rider problem here. So how could that be?
Yeah, so the most important thing is I'm not talking just about the EU, I talk about international, and I talk about conditional transfers, which is a taboo in the international arena, because conditional transfers, so if we provide such a thing, so then Bangladesh or these countries have to do something. They should then implement the carbon price. And this is basically then to help them the carbon price. And then over time, we can ratchet up the carbon prices. So it's not just a free lunch. So they have to do something, and they have to, in exchange to provide increasing carbon prices. And we pay them a little bit of the capital costs.
Right. So let me say again, there is the opportunity to ask questions over the chat, if I'm not mistaken. So all participants are invited to ask questions. I'm not sure I'm in the right chat here. Let me. Okay, yes, now I have it. So there is a number of questions. Let me get it started. Okay, so here's a question from Ludger Schuknecht. If you suggest a minimum price, why not also a maximum price? I think you did suggest both, did you? Or...
Yes.
Okay.
I argue for a price collar.
Okay. So here is a question from Nazir Khan. Do you think countries like India would be in a position to implement Picobian taxes or a similar tax regulatory program as European countries?
That's a very interesting question. India has a very small coal tax, but there's here one problem, and that's quite interesting. So the power sector in India is very much dominated by the state. There is no market. There is no power market. And of course, one of the biggest problems is that this highly state-owned power markets, in particular in Asian countries, and in order to implement such a price scheme, needs also a liberalization of the power markets. The interesting case is now Vietnam. Vietnam last week has announced that they would like to phase out coal, and in conjunction with the phase out of coal, they would also like to reform the power market in Vietnam. So these are quite interesting signs. So probably we should focus a little bit more on the smaller Asian countries and not just on China and India, because in the smaller Asian countries there are 1 billion people, and they can reduce a lot of cumulative CO2 over the next few decades. But there's some policy change here which we can build on.
Thank you. So here's a question by Ekatia Neba. You highlighted the huge variance in CO2 prices across sectors. Isn't this a first best perspective, and should we not focus instead in our second best world more on those actors where political problems and uncertainties are less?
Yeah, I agree. It's a first best perspective, but the EU Commission and the EU member states have already decided to be very ambitious in the transport sector, in the heating and the building sector. So this is not just a fantasy of a few economists. It's now basically written in law. And I think even in a second best scenario, think about the following scenario in the next few years. We might have a carbon price of 30 euros per ton CO2 in the EU ETS, and we could have a carbon price in the other sectors above 100 euros per ton CO2. I don't think, though, this is a sustainable option. In one way or another, people will ask to use this flexibility, and therefore I would say this is a moment which we should use for an integrated approach. And I think economists are very well advised to participate in this debate. In general, I would say yes. This is from a second best perspective. There are some arguments to accept some kind of sector-specific policies, but I would argue we are already beyond that stage because we are so ambitious in targets that we really need to capture this efficiency potentials.
Thank you. So another question by Florence Flus about information. So on the international cooperation on coal, in how far would you think it makes sense to offer low interest rate loans for renewable investment in developing countries without conditions at first, for instance, through international investment banks, just to have with the objective to have many countries joining in, and then at a later stage, one could add conditions for additional loans. Would that make sense as a strategy?
It might be worthwhile to think about, but and probably in the beginning there is no choice to do it unconditional. But I would like to work hard that in the international arena we can talk in a few years from now on conditional transfers, because we have a quite strange situation where basically we have the Green Climate Fund, and the Green Climate Fund can only hand out unconditional transfers, and the Green Climate Fund cannot find sufficient projects currently. It's a very strange thing, and it is perceived by many countries as a machinery for redistribution. And I think that's not the right way to do. And conditional transfer seems to me a very healthy thing. And international cooperation always needs reciprocity. And if you want to have reciprocity, so then you say, I cooperate with you when you cooperate with me. And I increase the carbon price when you increase the carbon price. And when you tell me you are poorer than I am, and I can say, okay, I have a self-interest to provide you a transfer because you increase the carbon price. I also benefit from this. So this kind of thinking seems to me should be part of the international negotiations, but you might be right in the very beginning. So we have no choice because it's a taboo, but nevertheless, it seems to me it's worthwhile to overcome this taboo.
A question related to that. So how should we imagine this? Would this conditionality be one where one would write down the entire climate policy strategy for the country? I suppose it cannot just refer to one project, because if they build a wind farm.
I fully agree. So we should overcome the project-based approach. I don't think this will work. So this is a complete bureaucratic monster. And we should not write down for the country the whole strategy. We should say, okay, we give you this transfer, and please tell me what kind of carbon price you want to implement. The carbon price is a nice thing because I can measure the effort. It's very transparent. In an international negotiation, we try to compare the voluntary contributions, right? One country says, I will implement the feed-in tariff system. Another country says, I will reduce emissions compared to a baseline. How can you compare such two policies? And the carbon price measures my effort and your effort. So and this is something which is quite transparent, and therefore this component of the carbon price could also create the reciprocity and the transparency thing. So that would be from my point of view a quite reasonable way to move on.
Okay, but that would have to be a carbon price which really covers all sectors, right? Something we don't even have ourselves. Is that right?
Yeah, of course. But here I would be pragmatic. So when coal is basically the power sector, and for many Asian countries, when coal is the most important problem, so then we have all the right to focus on the power sector. So let's deal with the transport sector and the building and heating sector at a later stage. So the coal coal is the threat from my point of view. And we should focus now on coal and not on too many things at the same time.
Right. Here is a question by Andreas Feichel related to COVID. Would it make sense to use Picobian taxes to finance the cost of the pandemic? I'm thinking, for instance, of taxing super spreader events, locations such as après ski bars in Austria, churches and other meeting places, and in general places where there is little social distancing, high physical proximity. So the application of the Picobian idea to the pandemic. So as long as you pay, you can go to the bar and does that make sense?
At least we should think about this. I think that's I would say from a practical point of view that the problem is I have to think about this, but the problem with Pigouvian taxation in such circumstances like COVID is always the suspicion of many people. This is something like repugnant. You do something very immoral when you basically. And it could be perceived then in the end as a fine. So I pay a fine, so to say, in order to be a super spreader, right? And this fine framework, think about Michael Sandel. So this gives the whole thing a very nasty thing. And I had a lot of discussions over the last few years with many people, and I would say with non-economists, this idea that economic incentives destroy intrinsic motivations and moral behavior. This is a very strong belief, and we should take this very seriously. And I like the idea of Andreas, but nevertheless, so that's something which needs. It might be an interesting paper to apply the Pigouvian idea on COVID. But also taking into account this moral motivations and moral framing.
Okay, so we've got 3 questions left here, and I'm afraid we will be running out of time then. 4, but then I'm afraid we'll have to close. So first, Leonzio Rizzo, what institution is giving the transfer? So about these transfers to other countries. So I think you mentioned an institution, but maybe a few comments on that. And where is the money coming from?
Yeah, the institution which we have now is the Green Climate Fund. This is a body. The money comes from the industrialized countries. It's basically about. It should be about 100 billion euros, and it's not clear if all the countries have fulfilled the promises. But the problem of the Green Climate Fund is that the Green Climate Fund channels the money based on projects, on specific projects, and they have a hard time to evaluate all these projects. And for the Green Climate Fund, it would be a huge progress if the Green Climate Fund would say, I give you this money, I give you this credit below the market interest rate, but then you have to implement the carbon price. So that's we are not there. We are, so this is very much project based.
So for time reasons, I would suggest to take the last 3 questions together. Okay.
Yeah, let's do that.
The first is from Ludger Schuknecht. So if you suggest a price collar or price corridor for the carbon price, who is going to determine it, and what about lobbies and yellow vests who will want to influence this across the board for some types of emission? Can there be an automatism, some kind of automatic rule? And related to that, the second question by Mireille Chirolu-Assouline. In France, carbon taxation has been massively rejected by the public, which apparently prefers command and control policies and even to ban specific activities or products. Do you think a price corridor would be more acceptable? I guess that's also related to what you said about the distributional questions, also beyond income inequality. And the third question, what by Bethany Miller-Powell, what tools could be used for countries that export a lot of coal, but have smaller emissions? That is, how to discourage emissions at the source.
Yeah, great questions. On the price collar from Ludger Schubnecht, a very good question, and also to give more an automatic rule. I very much in favor of this. But I would like to emphasize, so we have already in the European emissions trading scheme a kind of a mechanism which is called the Market Stability Reserve. It's an incredibly complicated mechanism to remove permits from the market when there is an excess on the market. And I would say this is so complicated even for experts that investors cannot anticipate what the price effect of this rule, and therefore a price collar based on a quite automatic rule, which the policymakers have not too much flexibility, would be good. And I think it should be an independent authority, so something like the European Central Bank, European Carbon Bank, managing this enormously complex entity like a European emissions trading scheme consisting of all sectors. It's worthwhile to consider. In France, on the price collar, I have some doubts. I would say, from my German experience, this horizontal equity issue is incredibly important. Whenever I talk to people, this rural-urban divide, this was important. And it seems to me addressing horizontal and vertical distributional issues is essential. Without that, policymakers cannot be convinced by efficiency arguments. So that this is my conclusion after working for 2 years very closely with decision makers. So we have to address the distributional, horizontal and vertical issues. And countries on export coal, that's a very complicated question because you refer here to production and consumption-based emission accounting. I would prefer a situation where basically everything is based on production-based accounting, and the CO2 price is imposed on the source. All other consumption-based systems are incredibly complicated, but this can only be done when basically so some transfers are available, and designing the transfer scheme in a reasonable way seems to me is important. And in this paper in the European Economic Republic, we have shown that a well-designed transfer scheme can enhance international cooperation significantly, but I assume much more research is needed here.
Thank you very much. Now we are slightly over time already, but it was absolutely worth it. So this was really a fantastic lecture to start our Congress here. Thank you very much for that, also for your very precise and informative answers to all those questions. So we appreciate this a lot. Thank you very much, Atma.
Thank you.